Welcome. This presentation is entitled "And They Shall Be One Flesh." My name is Brad Carmack, and I anticipate presenting this slideshow at the Strengthening the Family Conference, which will be held on the morning of October 29th, 2011 at the Provo Marriott Hotel. This is the outline for the presentation. First, I will summarize an article entitled "What is Marriage?" Second, I will talk about understanding reproduction. Third, we will discuss the teleology or purpose of sex. And then fourth, I'll draw a couple conclusions. Okay, so to start, let's talk a little bit about the article, What is Marriage? Just for my awareness of the audience, and again here for the digital audience, you can raise your hands from wherever you're sitting. Have you heard of Robert George? He's the one there in the middle. And then second, thank you, if you want to raise your hands, have you read at least part of the article entitled What is Marriage? What is Marriage was written by the three authors that you see there. Foremost amongst them, of course, is Robert George in the middle, who is a conservative legal scholar and well praised as one of the best Christian thinkers, conservative thinkers in the country. So the article came out in the winter of 2010. It was entitled What is Marriage by those three authors there, Robert George, Sheriff Gurgis, and Ryan Anderson. And it received a lot of attention, both critical and positive. So some of the main points. The authors ask in the title, what is marriage? This is their answer. This is crucial language here, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more depth as we go on. They say marriage is the union of a man and a woman who make a permanent and exclusive commitment to each other of the type that is naturally fulfilled by bearing and rearing children together. The spouses seal and renew their union by conjugal acts. That's a key phrase. Acts that constitute the behavioral part of the process of reproduction, thus uniting them as a reproductive unit. Some of the main takeaways from the article. It's an anti-same-sex marriage article claiming that same-sex couples cannot constitute true marriages, but they do claim that infertile opposite-sex couples can achieve real marriage as long as that infertile opposite-sex couple has vaginal intercourse. And that is the way that they're able to exclude same-sex couples and say that same-sex couples cannot achieve real marriage because vaginal intercourse is impossible for a same-sex couple. And we'll, of course, analyze their reasoning as we go on. Okay, so we're into now the beginning the second portion of this presentation. We talked about summarizing the article very, very briefly. We're going to go into some of their points in greater depth now, beginning with understanding reproduction, which is a crux of the author's argument. And again, all of this presentation is going to be a response critiquing the article by these authors. So, the authors say, marriage is a comprehensive union of two sexually complementary persons. The question, of course, is what does that look like? What is a couple where the two are sexually complementary? Probably most of you first thought of complementary structures. So we think of genitals, for instance, the penis fitting in a vagina. So we think perhaps that couple is a man and a woman is sexually complementary. However, there are other possible ways to discern a sexually complementary couple. For instance, you could ask about a complementary orientation. There are multiple sexual orientations, but the two most common, of course, are towards men and towards women. We're familiar with the common icon of a male and a female. Of course, the protruding shape indicates the biological sex of the individual, the one on the left, of course, being male, and the one on the right being female. I'd like to alter this icon a little bit to introduce, rather than merely the biological sex of the individual, the sexual orientation of the individual. So obviously this is an elementary drawing, but the point is that the protruding shape here is indicative of the biological sex of the individual. The intruding shape is indicative of the orientation, the sexual orientation of the individual. So as you might deduce, this is a straight male. The protruding symbol showing that it's a male, the intruding symbol showing that there's a sexual orientation towards a individual whose biological sex is female. Alright, so we got my introduction of a little nuance to the symbol. Let's talk a little bit about which is a better basis for sexual complementarity. I would say they're fairly equivalent. And the reason I would say they're equivalent is because they're both equally biological. The reason that you or I have a penis or vagina is because of biological factors, most ostensibly hormones and genes, and that's the same etiological or causative factors that are responsible for sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is a subset of the sex determinism sex differentiation of the brain. So even though the two, genitals and orientation, have two different anatomical locations, sexual orientation housed in the brain, genitals housed in the ventral inferior abdomen, they're both equally biological, and they're both sexual, which means they can both suffice as a basis for sexual complementarity. So let's apply this construct. What you've got here is a picture of a female on the left, biologically female, with a sexual orientation towards men. On the right, you've got a biological male with a sexual orientation towards female. Of course, this is a standard heterosexual couple, man and a woman that are both sexually oriented towards each other. So you've got two genders in this couple, and two different orientations, one towards men and one towards women. However, this next picture also has sexual complementarity in that the orientations are both towards the partner in the couple. So the one on the left has an orientation towards the biological sex of the partner on the right. The partner on the right has an orientation towards the biological sex of the person on the left. This, of course, represents a homosexual male couple. So they have this natural dynamism, this matching, this complementarity. You can compare the two and see that as to their complementariness of their orientations, these two couples are equivalent. Bottom line, rather than excluding same-sex couples, this reasoning used by the author of sexual complementarity can be used to include same-sex couples that have an orientation towards the biological sex of the partner. We're going to stay here, and this is again section 2. We're going to talk a little bit more about a slightly different tack on understanding production. This is another quote from the authors. You've seen this before. The spouses seal and renew their union by conjugal acts, acts that constitute the behavioral part of the process of reproduction, which unites them as a reproductive unit, a reproductive whole. Now, if you think about the process of sex and procreation, what is the only necessary, or what are the necessary behavioral steps in this process? Most of it, of course, is non-behavioral. Fertilization takes place without any decision by humans. It takes place from the behavior of the cells, which we don't control directly. The only behavioral element of reproduction of the procreative process is, in fact, male ejaculation. There's no behavior needed. Ovulation by a woman is not a voluntary process. It happens without her input or without her consent, and oftentimes without her knowledge. In fact, I would say every time that a woman ovulates without her knowledge. But a male, on the other hand, has a lot of volition over the process of when he excretes his gametes. Of course, the instance of rape proves the point that female participation is not required, since indeed the female's behavioral contribution can be overcome to still have a successful procreative episode. So, the authors have the claim of this organic bodily union being central and a crux, a discriminator of what can and what cannot be a marriage. The question, of course, is, can rape be a conjugal act? The authors talk about whether or not a couple is trying to have a child or intends to have a child doesn't matter. What matters is facts about what's going on between their bodies. Of course, an infertile opposite-sex couple having sex oftentimes is not intending to make a child, and even if they were, they're probably aware, if they're infertile, of the infertility, and thus the futility of so trying. As the authors say, it doesn't matter. So, indeed, rape could be an organic bodily union. That is their litmus test for what makes a marriage. One could also ask why the fact that a particular type of sex is vaginal is more important than other candidate bases for discerning a marital sort of type of intercourse. For instance, whether the intercourse is accompanied by commitment or whether it's consensual. And many would ask, well, does it really matter what goes on in the bedroom as far as whether the sex of a couple is oral or anal or vaginal or otherwise? Fourth question that's kind of comes up when analyzing this organic bodily union argument by the authors is the situation or the case of a male-male couple. Again, if the only behavioral element necessary is in fact male ejaculation, then a male-male couple is capable of achieving male ejaculation, in which case they satisfy the requirements for a conjugal act as asserted by the authors. A little bit more close to the heart, a little bit less up in the clouds. What about happens when you have a couple, let's say they're engaged to be married, and a few weeks before the wedding, the husband has an accident at work and loses his penis. Obviously, he and his fiancée, or when their marriage ceremony is performed, can no longer engage in vaginal intercourse. From my reading of the author's argument, that couple would no longer be candidates for a real marriage. Again, the authors aren't merely saying that man-only women or man-woman only marriage is the only possible one just because of the fact that they're male and female, because that would merely be a tautology. It would be defining a rose as a rose. They're making a substantive argument that the ability to engage in vaginal intercourse separates a couple that can't be married, namely a same-sex couple, from a couple that can achieve marriage, which is an opposite-sex couple. The same situation from the female side. You say you've got a vulnerable female who has vaginal cancer and has a vaginectomy. Obviously, she can no longer have vaginal intercourse with a fiancé or husband. So the question is, as the authors argue, it's important to teach some moral truth about marriage. And it seems the logical conclusion would be that we would need to deny a marriage license to this couple as well, where the woman had a vaginectomy because of their inability to engage in organic bodily union, to have a sexual intercourse of the type that is naturally oriented towards bearing and rearing children in the author language. Okay. Now, again, I would note, not all men can have vaginal intercourse, neither can all women. It's not definitional. You can have a man that doesn't have a penis that is no less a man than one that does. Until we're ready to seriously say to couples, opposite-sex couples, where they can't engage in vaginal intercourse, unless we're willing to say, no, you cannot have a real marriage, and we're not going to give you a marriage license. Until that day, it's not consistent to deny marriage to same-sex couples merely on that basis of their inability to achieve vaginal intercourse. Now, there are other bases that you could deny to same-sex couples. For instance, if fertility or reproduction is important to you, that's fine, but you're going to have to exclude marriage to infertile couples as well, and arguably also to couples that are unwilling to bear children, etc., etc. Most scholars are unwilling to go down that route. The authors use the phrase natural dynamism. They say that vaginal intercourse has this natural dynamism or orientation towards procreation. I would argue that it's not the number of genders that matters on both ends of the sexual intercourse. It's the fertility of both partners that does. Certainly a same-sex couple is infertile, but there are many opposite-sex couples that are equally infertile, that are inherently infertile. For instance, where the woman inherited her infertility because of, say, a gene that upstream in the oogenesis process made it impossible for her to ovulate. She's inherently infertile, and therefore cannot be said to have a natural dynamism of her procreative sex towards procreation, since she cannot have any children. So, we're still here in the understanding reproduction piece, analyzing the author's arguments about organic bodily union, or vaginal intercourse. I'm going to ask for a raise of hands here. How many of you knew the following fact? Go ahead and raise your hands. Digital audience too. Alright. So I'm guessing that for some of you this is a surprise. It certainly was for me when I learned it a couple of years ago. It makes sense if you think about it. A male and a female share 45 out of their 46 chromosomes. Again, we have 23 chromosome pairs in the human genome. The only one that's different is that last pair is either an XX for women or an XY for men. Since a woman makes the egg, you can bet that she's not relying on the Y chromosome to make the egg, and it therefore follows, and of course you can ask your friendly neighborhood embryologist or biologist the same question to find out that in fact a human male does have all the genetic instructions needed to manufacture a human egg. What we've got here is a picture of a mouse. That mouse has two and only two biological parents, two male mice. Again, the reason is because me as a male, the cheek swab from me has every genetic instruction needed to make a human egg. In fact, if I had a same-sex partner and was able to stimulate my cheek cell into the path of oogenesis to make a human egg, it could be fertilized with the sperm from my same-sex partner, and we could indeed have a child with two and only two biological parents, me and my same-sex partner. Quick straw poll here. For how many of you was that a surprise? If it was a surprise, raise your hand, including the digital audience. Okay. If it wasn't, all right. So the main point here is infertile heterosexual couples, again opposite-sex couples, are no more or less able to procreate or oriented towards reproduction than lesbian and gay couples, because both lesbian couples, gay couples, and infertile opposite-sex couples have every genetic construction needed to make a human egg. The only problem, of course, is downstream with the technology of whether or not they're able to have procreation with non-natural goods, which of course most of us have no problem with the infertile couple using reproductive technologies to assist them in having a child. So we'll move on from understanding reproduction and talk a little bit about the teleology or purpose of sex. This is a very important point of the authors, a necessary one, where they claim that vaginal intercourse specifically is oriented towards bearing children and conception. They claim, this is a quote from the article, individual adults are naturally incomplete with respect to one biological function, sexual reproduction. And they talk about how the bodies become one. Again, this is the title of my address, that biblical verse, and they shall be one flesh. The authors say that vaginal intercourse is a point in time when the two partners are coordinating for the biological good of the whole, the biological good of the couple. I've entitled this segment, "The Darwin is in the Details." Let's take a little look deeper down here. So the authors say that during vaginal intercourse, the male and female are performing the first step of the complex reproductive process. The first step. Well, let's take a step back. What is the process that evolved sex in the first place? What's the process that evolved the penis and the vagina? What's the process that evolved intercourse? There are plenty of creatures out there that don't use sexual reproduction. Take a look at your friendly neighborhood bacteria. They produce just fine and reproduce asexually. They don't have male and female. At some point in our evolutionary past, male and female evolved. Intercourse evolved. What is that process? It's natural selection. And natural selection does not operate at the level of the individual. It doesn't operate at the level only of the population or the organ or the couple. It operates at the level of the gene, because the gene is the replicator. The gene is what gets copied exactly and passed down. You may notice that your great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-great-grandparents are no longer alive. Their identities are lost. The couple is lost, but their genes persist. So taking a step back, natural selection, when it comes to reproduction, begins with DNA replication, not with sex. Let's talk about this a little bit more to show how sexual reproduction is not the only way that genes are able to advance their interests. So let's take this example. You've got two warring tribes. You've got a soldier from one tribe, a male virgin named David, and he's fighting the enemy tribe. He kills 3 of the enemy tribe members before he himself is slain. So of course he dies without ever procreating. However, his actions favor some genes over others. Okay? His acts favor some genes over others. Now again, it's the selfish genes that are promoting their own interests of being copied in competition against other genes, and the level of the individual is merely one stage of cooperative competition. And we have about 26,000 genes in the human genome, and so they're cooperating in competition against other sets of genes. But again, the competition is at the level of the gene, not the level of the individual. So David was able to have a role to play in the reproductive battle in the game of life, even though he never rolled the procreative dice. Okay, so sexual reproduction is just one of many useful Darwinian strategies employed by selfish genes. Parasitism, symbiosis, kin altruism, etc. are some other examples. So the authors say that man and woman as a couple form a biological unit of reproduction, and the biological good of that couple is their reproduction. But again, humans don't replicate. Look at how different your father is from you. When you engage in sex, you are passing along, out of all the tissues that your body manufactures, a particular tissue that is the least you of almost any that you make. In fact, I can't think of any tissue that the body makes that is less you than as the gametes that you pass on. Not only is it only half of your genome. The other half doesn't get passed on, but it's a recombined half. You sometimes pass along alleles that you never expressed in your own life. It's very much not you, and you can clearly see that just by looking at one's own parents. However, that type of reproduction, sexual reproduction, does benefit the sovereign gene. Although it doesn't benefit the subordinate couple, it does benefit the sovereign gene. And another way to look at this, another perspective, is to see how quickly a couple dies. Your great-great-great-great-grandparents are no longer alive, their identity is gone, but the genes that they passed on are persisting in the population, and they're persisting in you. Okay, so individuals and pairs of individuals are merely instruments. They're secondary to the primary level of competition that's going on, which is natural selection at the level of the gene. Okay? So the authors say that there's only one possible good that sex can be oriented towards. That's the biological reproduction for the good of the whole or the couple. Well, there's a number of other candidate purposes of sex, if you wanted to call them those. If you want to be teleological, one would be pleasure, and the authors do touch on that a little bit. I would note that pleasure occurs much more often in connection with sexual intercourse than does conception. And pair bonding as well is another extremely frequent and highly conserved consequence of sexual reproduction that does not result in a child, and is argued with David again, who didn't reproduce at all but was able to affect the competition of genes in the battlefield that we call life. Pair bonding can be extremely valuable as well. Another way to look at this principle, to illustrate it, you think of fingers that were once used for grasping fruit and branches that later became used for strumming cellos and painting masterpieces. In a similar way, vaginal intercourse could entirely lose its connection to sexual reproduction. You know, we could easily envision a future where, for instance, people live for millennia rather than decades, where reproduction takes place by cloning or takes place in the lab rather than the good old-fashioned way. We can imagine a number of scenarios where vaginal intercourse would be conserved even though it lost that function of reproducing. Natural selection never makes a necessary connection between a particular function and a behavior. Again, harkening back to the example of a macromolecule that millennia ago was used to transport wastes, completely lost that function, is now only used for clotting blood. Okay, so there's never a necessary teleology to a particular behavior or structure in biology. Bottom line, you got two options. Either no purpose can be attached to vaginal intercourse because natural selection is an undirected and continuing process, or, alternatively, it's not clear that the purpose of vaginal intercourse is procreation, because there could be future consequences that it could be selected for, and indeed, even presently, there are two likely competitors, pair bonding and pleasure, which could be considered the purpose of sexual reproduction or vaginal intercourse more narrowly, if there can be indeed any purpose ascribed to the behavior, the biological behavior that's vaginal intercourse. That's the line. So to wrap up, what are my conclusions? First, the author's reasoning fails to exclude same-sex couples. Even it tries to keep infertile same-sex couples in and keep same-sex couples out of its marriage construct, but it fails to do so, as I've demonstrated by the flaws in the construction of organic bodily union. And second of all, the author's reasoning relies necessarily on the way that they've depicted reproduction, and that reflects a flawed understanding of Darwinian selection, which of course is a necessary conversation since Darwinian selection is what evolved sexual intercourse in the first place. My invitations to you as a listener, I would invite you to read my paper, which is entitled "And They Shall Be One Flesh." If you don't want to wait or find it on the website for Students for the Family, please email me at bradleycarmack@gmail.com. Thank you.